Hi, everybody, and welcome to Dungeon Design Dissection. I hope that's all what you were here for. If not, welcome anyway. My name is Linda Zayas-Palmer, and I am a developer on the organized play team. So I have worked a lot with, in particular, Pathfinder Society scenarios and the design that goes into those, as well as my experience as a GM.
And I'm Ron Lundeen. I'm a developer on primarily for the Pathfinder adventure path, so a lot of deep adventure experience.
And I'm Jason Tondro. I am a Starfinder developer on adventure paths. I'm also the author of Starfinder 18 and Pathfinder 151, which I wrote for you, and another Starfinder adventure that has not been announced yet. So, come on.
All right. So where do we want to get started off? So when you're talking about designing a dungeon, the first thing to think about is, well, what is this dungeon going to be for? Who is going to be living in this dungeon? And how are they going to be interacting with each other? Because if you're going to have a dungeon where you're going to have a lot of different creatures that are in the dungeon and you don't necessarily want them all to be combining into the same giant encounter, then you're going to need space to be between them. And also, when you have a dungeon, I mean, unless you're having undead, mindless undead constructs and something like that, like living creatures, they don't just sit in a room all day and wait for adventurers to come and kill them, right? They have a life where they move around. They're gonna have places where they eat. They're gonna have dreams. They have dreams. They have hopes. They're gonna have places where they eat. They're gonna have places where they sleep. They're gonna have places where they hang out. They're gonna have places where they stand and guard. They're gonna have all these other things that they're doing. So, and at a fundamental level, when I'm looking at the design of a dungeon, I'm looking at who is there, what are they doing while they're there, and what is the function that space is serving.
Okay. From a one thing to keep in mind with any dungeon, it's fundamentally being presented for two audiences. The first is the reader, who ought to be the game master. Rather than the player, but it's also being presented for the player experience. And I've held that there are actually three phases in which a player experiences a dungeon. And I used to be able to talk about these sort of very much in the abstract, right? There's the initial phase where the players aren't quite sure what the scope of the dungeon is. They know what they're there to do, but they don't have any idea how big it is or what sort of threats are going to be facing, except in the first few rooms. And the second phase, which is about the players kind of having sense of the whole scope of the dungeon, how big it is, what the themes of the stuff that are there are, but they haven't finished it, right? They haven't found whatever it is they're there to get, or the monster ultimate boss monster they're there to defeat. And then the third monster pivots once they do recover the MacGuffin they were there to get, or defeated the boss they were there to get. That's kind of the cleanup. Okay, I haven't been to every single room, but this is where they go. Everything they said throughout the dungeon, we'll go back and get that. This is where they go back and get that. The players at this point feel like they've got a lot of mastery of the dungeon, and it's also the place where the GM is most likely to kind of hand wave, right? Okay, sure, the treasure's hidden behind a secret panel with sort of a low difficulty locker trap on it. It's a place where a GM's like, you find it. You find it right down, 450 GP or whatever. Those three phases have a specific arc of player ignorance to confidence to mastery, and that is an excellent arc for the players to feel like they're winning something, regardless of how the dice are going. So I've been able to talk about this in the abstract for the longest time, but I can give you a very specific example with only slight spoilers for one of the Starfinder Adventure Paths adventures, because I'm playing it. And we found this derelict spaceship, and we had no idea who was on it. They weren't responding to any of our hails. So we got on the derelict spaceship. We got a couple of rooms in, and there was like this weird creature that obviously wasn't part of the original crew that sort of tricked us into thinking that maybe it was, but we saw through that ruse. And then some of the people on the ship we found some bodies of people that had been killed. Wait,
is this Dead Sons?
It is Dead Sons. Yeah, all right. Anyway, so we got through a couple of the rooms, and then we stopped for the evening. And I'm like, and then I realized, what? this is phase one. I'm in phase one of this dungeon as a player that I've been talking about. The next session, which was much shorter, we managed to get all the way through to the other end of the ship. So at that point, we could see on the map, like, okay, we know the ship is this big. We know that the people that were in it are dead, and we know why, except we know that there's one person who's sort of holed up on the bridge that we can't yet get to. And end of the session. I'm like, and this is phase 2, right? I'm living this, right? And so once we get back, we know now how to get into the bridge. We know who that we're going to face in the bridge. But we know there are a couple of rooms that we're not going to get. We're going to do what we need to do to get there. And there's going to be a couple of rooms that I fully expect our GM to be like, now that you've conquered the person on the bridge, you explore the rest of the ship. At least I hope that's the case, because I've already been insisting that this is my ship now, and that I'm going to be the captain of the ship. The rest of the players maybe don't agree.
Are you sure you're not going to spend an entire section like searching inside of the brig and like seeing if anybody hid something under their mattress or
That
anything
would
like
be.
that?
I would prefer to have that sort of show up organically. That would be the most exciting for me. Like 4 adventures in, for the GM to be like, oh, and plus there's this thing under the mattress that you never knew was there. Anyway, so that's the 3 phases to keep in mind: the feelings they have on players, and the fact that I'm feeling them. So,
Who here is interested in writing adventures? And who here is mostly here for DMing or running adventures, dungeons in their home group? Okay, so mostly the second, but quite a few of the former. One of the things that I've really been interested in lately, that I've been thinking about a lot lately, is the replayability of dungeons and the possibility of creating a dungeon in which there are multiple paths through it, so that when 2 different groups or gamers from 2 different groups meet up at their local game store and they compare their experience to White Plume Mountain or whatever, their stories are completely different, right? Which is sort of the holy grail for me, right? But that's only important if you're writing the adventure, because if it's just for your home group, they're only going to run through it once, probably, right? I mean, there are rare exceptions, of course, which prove the rule, but so you don't have to make a dungeon with replayability, because your players aren't going to want to replay it, right? So and I was interested by your observation about these sort of 3 levels, because as the players increase in mastery, the suspension or tension of the dungeon decreases. And it becomes, in many ways, less interesting as the players master it, right? And so you have to fill that gap in suspense with other things. Like, oh, that's the boss that we're here to get, right? And the boss's personality becomes more interesting than the dungeon, which is the initial source of tension, right? There's a long-standing sort of trope when we talk about dungeons, that dungeons are kind of like a flow chart in D&D, right? You either go left and you fight the ogre, or you go right and you fight the orcs, right? And your goal is to get all the way down to the bottom of the flow chart where the MacGuffin is. And this is a...
Can you represent? Just because I don't know if that's a familiar term to everybody.
Do we know what a MacGuffin is? It's a Hitchcock term, the thing all the spies are after. It's from Hitchcock's movies. Okay. And this is a very mechanical and in many ways very sterile way of looking at dungeons, but all the fun stuff comes later. Like we don't let's just think of the dungeon as like a spreadsheet, or talk about its most basic mechanical functions. And then at every one of those turns in the flow chart, your players have to expend resources, right? And then where is there opportunities to regain resources? And so it can get very mechanical. And when I was early in my dungeon writing career, I spent a lot of time sweating that stuff. Like, okay, am I giving them enough treasure to get them to the end of the flow chart? Are they getting enough XP to level at the right moments? But I think, how many people here use some sort of milestone advancement? Almost look around. Yay! Almost everyone.
More hands, more.
And we encourage that, but at the same time, I know that also as developers, we also go back through it and we do all the math to make sure that the characters advance at the right times, even as we're hoping all of you raise your hands to the milestone question, right? So when you get to this important moment, everybody levels, and we don't worry about the flow chart so much, you know? I don't have a lot of answers here. I'm just trying to sort of talk about the things I've been thinking about lately. Do we have anybody here who's played either The One Ring or Adventures in Middle-earth? Oh, you are missing out. Oh, you're missing out.
We work for Paizo.
I'm talking. You play other games. I know you do.
That's true.
The reason why I bring it up is because in those games and in the model of epic fantasy which those games model, the big dungeon is a rarity, right? I mean, you've got Moria as the classic archetypal dungeon crawl, but most of the time it's all about the journey. And this has become very interesting because in those games, the journey replaces the flowchart. The journey is the flowchart. So the players don't get to rest while they're traveling. Unless you're in a very safe place, unless you're in Rivendell or Lothlorien, you don't get a long rest. You don't get to refill your spell slots. You don't get hit points back. The journey is the flowchart. And then at the very end, there's like 1 or 2 encounters with the boss in a dungeon, a little tiny mini dungeon, right? So there's a lot of ways to do this, a lot of creative solutions to this, which can be very interesting. And like I said, I don't really have any answers here. I'm just sort of talking about the things that have been on my mind lately. We take questions?
Yeah, well, I have a thought on what you were saying there
Yeah.
in terms of both the player feeling like they completely master the dungeon and then maybe wanting ways to have interest in the dungeon after that point.
Yeah.
And also in terms of trying to have a good sense of when people are going to level up. There are certain things that create natural transitions in dungeons that are going to encourage people to rest, such as the long winding staircase leading down
Yes.
into that other area. When there's this strong change in the description of what the area looks like, say you're dealing with the base that's on the upper level, but then you find the passageway to go into the secret cultist chambers that are in the ancient temple below, or these caverns that lead down slightly into the Darklands, but then you have these other things going on. Those sorts of things can both signal to your players, okay, this is probably going to be a good time to rest before we see what that has in store. So you can use that as a catch-up point if you are using XP to say, okay, they've probably explored this, they're probably this level, and also to show them, well, we knew what was going on up here, but we don't know what's going on down here. So you can restart that cycle. If you want.
And treasure is another great way of re-adding that suspense and tension that disappears as the dungeon is explored, because you give them these cool new things that they don't know how to use, right? So now they have to come up with new levels of mastery to learn how to use the fancy new widget that you gave them, right? And that like, we know the dungeon, but how does this staff work, right? And can I figure out how to use it in time to fight the big bad at the end?
I have a specific example with each of these that I think is helpful. One of my favorite rest point techniques in a dungeon is to have the PCs find a room or area that it is clear to them that nobody else in the dungeon knows is there.
Yeah,
right?
it may as well have a sign on it that says long rest
hidden
here.
vault. Yeah, exactly. Hidden vault or whatever.
Yeah.
And they without being told specifically, the hobgoblins that are otherwise in this area don't know about this old secret vault. This is a safe place to rest. That makes them. It goes back to making the PCs feel clever. Right? The players feel smart when they're like, "Wait a minute, this place is covered in dust. Nobody's been here. You can probably rest here." You're sort of nodding. So that's one of the techniques that I like to use. You'd mentioned finding treasure. In order to build the suspense, finding treasure but not knowing what it does.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think can be used with good effect in that regard is introduce mid-dungeon something of a little bit of scavenger hunt. You mentioned a staff. Well, here's a staff that plainly has like a housing and a crystal on it that are both gone. Okay, now as we find these, as we gain greater mastery of the dungeon, we're also doing this other thing. Once we get it together, the staff's going to do something. What? We don't know, right?
And the idea of the collector set can be a great way to get players motivated to explore the dungeon. And it's also a clear and easy goal. Like, okay, we found these two things. They seem to be related. Maybe there's more. Yeah.
Well, one that I forget what adventure it was, but I remember an adventure where we found one boot of speed, and we knew we needed to somewhere find the other boot. And so it was like, okay, well, wherever they went, wherever our foes went after they were here, that's probably where that other missing shoe is.
I am stealing the boot of speed. I am totally stealing that. That's brilliant.
Can I just plug real quickly? A second edition adventure is available as of yesterday. I wrote called The Horseshoe Calamity, about this mixed tribe of humans and centaurs, where they found one horseshoe of flight, and the centaurs think the humans have the other ones. They sort of lost access to it, and finding the other three. In fact, it's a scavenger hunt to find the other three magic horseshoes that the centaurs really want.
So there you go. Natural
Alrighty.
sets. The players know there's got to be more here.
That's right. Yeah. But that actually gives one of the good motivations to explore a dungeon. One of the concerns in a particularly large dungeon area, whether that dungeon is a classic room of flagstone corridors and dripping slime and things like that, or whether it is an abandoned hospital, or whether it is a spaceship, or whether it's any sort of discrete collection of areas. That's really fundamentally what a dungeon is. It's sort of an area bounded by don't go past here, right? If you want to make sure that your players are getting something of a fuller exploration of it, one of the effective but perhaps heavy-handed ways is to just make mostly one way through it. You want to have some decisions for the players. You want the players to be making choices. But if the whole thing is basically a line with a few rooms, it's not very interesting, but you know full well the players are going to start here and they're going to go through all this stuff until they get here. And other ways to encourage the players to do more exploration, to hit more of the encounters that you've so carefully crafted in there, are to make something like, here's a collector set, either for treasure they have or something they must get before they're able to face the final boss, things that they're otherwise incentivize them to go through. If the MacGuffin, if they're trying to rescue a prisoner, maybe they're trying to rescue 3 prisoners that are in different locations. So things that sort of propel the players to go through, other than in a straight line, is something to think about when you're in the dungeon design mode.
Knowledge can be very powerful too, whether that's information about how to defeat this particular boss that's at the end, or information about their plans or things like that, so that the PCs know that they're preparing for a particular situation. Or if they're trying to stop someone from running off with information, and they know that if they just go to the end and they confront the boss, then the lackeys are going to run off, and you're going to have all these other threats that are still out there for you.
So you notice that in every one of us at some point has talked about a boss at the end, and I want to address that, not because there needs to be a boss, but I think because the dungeon is a map, and the players can go around it in a lot of different ways, it can often end in a very anticlimactic fashion. Like, okay, well, that was the last room, I guess we leave, right? And so the question is, how do we ensure that the final session of the dungeon has a lot of good energy and the players feel like they accomplished something significant? And the shorthand way to do that is an evil wizard with minions, right? Or whatever, like whatever your big boss of choice is. But I think that there are other ways to do that, like saving your coolest geography and landscape, for example, for the very end. Like create some fantastic location, or the source of the dungeon, whatever the dungeon is. Why is it here, and why was it made? Give the players knowledge that they would not otherwise be able to get. And that sort of thing can make even a faceless horde of orcs to be interesting. If when the players overcome those orcs, they knew that what they were doing was the keystone moment of the dungeon. Does that make sense? And then I have a couple of other quick points I just wanted to note. Remember that most of you are making an adventure for your players at home. Make the adventure for your players, right? Sometimes we have so much fun making dungeons and making worlds, and there is a lot of creative, artistic spirit that goes into that. And anybody who thinks that making dungeons is not an art can fight me. But at the same time, put stuff in there that you know your players are gonna respond to, right? They're the audience. They are the target. The only reason why there's a bunch of evil spiders in The Hobbit is because Tolkien's youngest child was afraid of spiders. Now, I'm not telling you all to prey on your players' arachnophobia. I'm not.
Don't do that.
I don't do that. But the point is that figure out what the stuff that your players find is cool. And I think we would all agree, you cannot predict what your players are going to find cool. You have to just throw a lot of stuff at them, keep your ear open, and when the players start responding to that one cool NPC or that one cool monster or that one cool room or that thing that you grab onto it, ignore the other hooks that you left for them, and follow that one like you're a dog on a bone, right? Mm-hmm. And give the players what they want. And then the last thing that I wanted to note is, or rather to ask everyone at the table, how do we deal with NPCs in the dungeon, right? Because the old version of this, if you're in the old school grognard version, like NPCs always betray you, so kill them the minute you see them, right? Because there is any NPC you meet is a thief with backstab. Just get to the point now. That's not how we do it anymore.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, what are the roles and how do you use NPCs in the dungeon in ways other than obviously just a bucket of XP and treasure?
Yeah, certainly. So a lot of the adventures I work on are for organized play, which means that I know that they are going to see lots and lots of replayability. They're going to have to cater to players with a wide variety of styles. So with dungeons in general, I like to see that there are opportunities to fight things, but there are also opportunities to use your skills. There are opportunities to be more social when you do things. When presenting NPCs, unless they are someone like, this is the fanatical cultist of Lamashtu who will fight to the death against anyone who possibly intrudes on her lair, the NPC is probably going to have their own motivations. And by presenting those motivations to, if you're writing the adventure, by presenting those to the GMs, or if you're jamming the adventure, by thinking about what is it that this NPC really wants, right? I mean, first of all, most people like to live. So, can they be convinced to stop fighting? Is there something else that they want more? Do they want money? Do they want power? Would they be willing to betray their own allies in order to get some additional advantage? Where do their allegiances lie? Is everybody actually all working together in the dungeon that you've got? So, yeah, I would say considering the motivations of each one, and that doesn't mean that you need to write backstories for every NPC that appears in it. Particularly, if there's someone that you expect the PCs to fight. But it's a good idea to have a list of names on hand, because so that if generic guard (3), one of them the PCs decide to have a long conversation with, you can just be like, oh yes, yes, this is a guard, and his name is totally not Bob.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that I like to keep in mind, and this goes back to something Linda was saying earlier, is to keep in mind that you're trying to add some verisimilitude to the inhabitants of your dungeon. From a very sort of 20,000 foot view, your players are the good guys and these are the bad guys. They're bad. So it's not at all unreasonable to think that among any dungeon filled with orcs or ogres or whatever, that some of them are going to want to betray the others. And think about this. So if you've got an old abandoned academy, right, that's chock full of vampires. I mean, you're one of the vampires. You've got the vampire boss. You go about the day doing your vampire things, and these heroes come these heroes come bursting in the door, and they've got weapons that produce sunlight, and they've got wooden stakes and holy water. This is the point at which you might be thinking, oh man, I've totally got to stop these people in order to keep them from getting to my boss. Or you might be thinking, that other vampire, I never liked that dude and I owe him a bunch of money. Maybe this is the time, if the PCs, do me half my hit points of damage and I know they're pretty confident, I'll go, wait, let me help you out, guys. Go this way, take care of that person for me, right? That's how you can turn sort of a monster encounter into an NPC encounter. Now, I know that most players worth their salt will probably do just that and then come back and take care of the vampire.
So he should run.
Which is probably fine. Mm-hmm. I like sort of the nested expectations where in the dungeon you've got a prisoner. Yeah. Okay, a prisoner can give some good information. But maybe you've got a prisoner that's sort of, you've got some sort of evil creature that's masquerading as a prisoner. All right, players have seen that before. But if you've got an evil creature that needs some sort of help, that's masquerading as a prisoner that the players find. Then it's a matter how deep they go, right? It's like, oh, here's a prisoner, we freed you. Here's my good information. Thank you, off you go. Or here's a prisoner, we freed you. Oh, but we've got, Detect Evil or whatever. We know you're a bad guy, so we fight you. Or we're about to fight you. Like, wait. This other guy. Anyway, so you can go sort of nested motivations. How deep you respond to your players, like you were saying, how deep they want to go.
One of the things that you'll see in virtually every Paizo adventure now, whether it's Starfinder or Pathfinder, is you'll see a line at the end of an encounter that says, if the PCs convince this person to not fight, award them XP as if they had defeated the monster, right? I wish we didn't have to say that. But we do.
I wish that were the default, right?
Yeah.
Then in any situation where you've talked your way past a monster.
Yeah. One of the things that was a big priority for me when I made Starfinder 18, which is Assault on the Crucible, I think it comes out in like a couple of weeks. It didn't make it for the con. But we created a bunch, and I had a lot of help here from Chris Sims, who was the Starfinder developer on the adventure. We created a bunch of factions in what's basically the biggest dungeon. I think it might be the biggest dungeon we've done in a Starfinder AP, because there's like one very brief couple of optional encounters on your way, but otherwise the entire AP is just the big base. It's a big base invasion, right?
Called the Crucible, I would guess. No spoilers, I'm playing this.
But. Not just a clever name. Yes, exactly. And so we wanted to avoid burnout, and we wanted to avoid it feeling like a slog. Right, so we put a bunch of other things in there. One of which is a countdown. Is anybody playing the Dawn of Flame AP? Okay, all right. So you know that I'm not spoiling too much here because this happened pretty early in the first adventure. But there's an overall invasion plot line, right? Like Ifriti from the Plane of Fire are invading the Pact Worlds, and anyway. So in the Assault on the Crucible, that big battle is happening while the players are invading the dungeon. So we created a countdown for the dungeon. So every fight you're in, the countdown goes up, right? And then at the end of the dungeon, you go back to the countdown to see how much damage got inflicted on the Burning Archipelago while you were fighting orcs, right? And obviously they're not orcs, but you know what I mean. And so we wanted to create energy and suspense and tension to make every player group try to decide, do we have to have this fight? Is this a fight that we have to have? Or can we sneak around it to save time, right? But at the same time, you need the loot and the XP and like, well, are we tough enough to fight the big boss at the end? Because we've been skipping all these encounters, so it becomes a kind of a challenge for that. But the other thing that we did was to create a bunch of factions inside the Crucible so that the players have the option, if they can gather information, if they can access the computers or spy on the various NPCs or whatever, and they can decide, okay, exactly what you were talking about, like there's all these potentials for turning one faction against the other, where if we can get into that room where they build the robots, maybe we can turn on the robot machine, or if we can talk to these void hags, maybe we can, So this creates all kinds of sort of levers that the players can either choose to flip
to void hags.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. They won't possibly betray you.
That sounds like not the best idea that people would have.
Well, so my point was just that think about this idea of multiple factions in your dungeon, especially the bigger it is, so that it has kind of different areas and different zones, each of which is controlled by a different group, and not all of which are necessarily hostile to the PCs immediately, so that the players can interact with them, and so that your bard has something to do, right? To talk to the NPCs, and they can learn about them, and maybe they can use that to their advantage somehow. And whether they do or not, that's going to create that idea of branching paths inside the dungeon, so that there isn't just one way to get through everything. And the players have meaningful choices, because that's ultimately the problem about thinking about dungeons as a flowchart, is that those choices do not seem meaningful. It doesn't matter if we fight the orcs and go left, or we fight the ogre and turn right, if all the point is to get to the bottom, right? Those choices aren't meaningful. So let's give them meaningful choices. That's one way to do it.
And another thing that can make order matter is the way that the occupants of the dungeon dynamically respond to the invasion, in terms of who leaves, who stays in the room that they were already in, who might combine up. who might backstab someone else, who might grab the treasure from this room with them and go to some safer location, that kind of thing. Because then there's the question of how do we approach matters, because you know that you might be raising the alarm. So are you going to go in the front gate of the keep? Because that may not be the best decision you've ever had. Or are you going to try to sneak in through the sewer entrance? Are you going to try to put up a grappling hook and sneak up through one of the windows? What are you going to do? How are you going to approach? And then the order in which you do things matters.
And this is a great opportunity to talk about our prep time for dungeons, right? You can spend a lot of time designing the dungeon, and you can spend weeks or months designing the dungeon, and then the players start on it, and you feel like, well, I don't have anything to do now. And now I'm just sort of running them through the dungeon. But in actuality, every time they stop at that point to rest, now you have a week or 2 weeks or however long before your next game to think about how the dungeon responds to what the players have done, right? So you can use that time, like, okay, more monsters fill in these rooms. I love your idea about how monsters from one room go steal the treasure from this other room, right? Like move the dungeon around so that the players maybe even go back a little bit on that mastery of the dungeon because they find out that it's changed when they weren't looking. If you can give the players the impression that the world moves when they're not looking at it, you've won DMing, right? Like you've won the game.
Especially if you have the players that always do that same tactic and then someone gets away. So it's like, okay, the wizard always fireballs every room when they go in. But somebody got away, and in the next room it's like, it seems like the enemies are resistant to fire. I wonder why that is. I wonder if they got some spells cast to be prepared for what the PCs are doing. So, I mean, it's not really fair to the PCs just to have that come out of nowhere. But sure, if there's a reasonable reason why their opponents would have the resources and then be able to prepare for those sorts of tactics that the PCs use, then that also lets it respond to them.
Yeah, lean into that. If the players come fight a second group after letting somebody survive, they have that second group go, go for that archer, because the archer was most effective in the previous fight. That makes the player both feel a little nervous and feel like they're the ones. Look, hey, I'm important enough that these monsters are wanting to target me, unfortunately.
Yeah. Or like, watch out for that shield guy. He's gonna block it for everybody else, or things like that. They know what the PCs are gonna do and they respond to that. And that also encourages the players to shake up their tactics a little bit to catch the enemies on their toes. And it can be fun, they're resistant to fire, whatever, and then the enemy for the fireball, and the enemy says, oh, haha, like we are prepared for you. And then the wizard says, okay. Chain lightning or whatever. It's like, hey, you didn't do that last time.
No fair.
No fair.
Do you want to take a few questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, cool. I do a lot of puzzles, and that's where I struggle with puzzle balance in dungeons.
Yeah.
Not only with the amount of puzzles, but then also the difficulty of
Yeah.
puzzles.
Yeah.
So, comments?
Oh, yes. So, I am also a big fan of puzzles in dungeons, and I know there are a lot of resources online for finding puzzles. And you can take puzzles that are as sort of modern or mundane as you've got, Al and Bill and Cyril who, trying to get these three things into these three houses, or they got these three pets, Einstein's zebra problem. But you can reflavor a lot of puzzles very easily to fit within your world. When you do so intelligently. Nobody in the dungeon is going to put a ridiculously difficult puzzle on a door that has the bathroom on the other side, I guess. But I think anyway, but as far as the difficulty of the puzzles, one of the things that I think is that you should do is make sure that you're providing. You have to worry about too easy or too hard, and I don't know which one in particular you're worried about. But let me say, if for something that is too hard, it is good to allow the players to have their characters make intelligence, wisdom checks, whatever, in order to give them clues. So when you're designing a puzzle, make sure you've got kind of a couple of clues that you can give. They don't necessarily give it away. As far as too easy, that's actually not a problem, because if you've got somebody who, I put a puzzle into an adventure that Paizo did recently, and one of the comments on the forum was, "Oh, we got to this puzzle, and it was just like this one I knew that somebody in our group had seen, and so we got right past it." And I think the intent was was to say that puzzle was too easy, but I took it as actually a positive. I'm like, oh, because that person, right, even if their character is the dumb barbarian, is like, wait, this is a thing I know. I'm like, how good must that person have felt at the time to see that and go, oh, I know it, right? That's a win for the table. In both cases, though, if your players hate puzzles, don't include them, right? Because we're coming together to have fun, and if you were going over to to play this game, and in the middle of the game, everybody's got to fill out tax forms, right? Because your accountant GM thinks that's an awful lot of fun. Players aren't gonna stay for very long. But it's the same with puzzles. If you know your players dislike puzzles, don't design them in your adventures. And if you've got a published adventure, I know in ours we spend a lot of time dropping in a side percent. Look, if your players hate puzzles, do this instead, right?
My most memorable experience with a puzzle was the players were going through this dungeon, and there was this room with a bunch of skeletons, like sort of swarming them from all over, and there was a door that they had to get through. And so to unlock the door, they had to do a puzzle, right? So I put it there for the rogue, to give the rogue something to do, because rogues are lousy against undead, right? Like sneak attack doesn't work on them. So let's give the rogue like this really cool puzzle that she has to figure out while everybody else is fighting off the undead. Except I thought, well, I don't want to make it I don't know what to do for the puzzle, so I used a Sudoku, right, as a puzzle. Well, little did I know that my rogue does like 5 Sudokus every day before breakfast. So she literally did it in like 30 seconds. Like I was watching her, she did 30 seconds. Well, so much for that thing, right? Know your players. Right? Know your players. At the same time, I gave this puzzle to my Starfinder group that I've been running for the last year and a half, and I gave him this cool puzzle, and I thought this might be too easy because if he just Googles it, it'll come up like that. And he refused to Google it. And he would never have solved it if another player hadn't done it for him. Right? And he actually felt really bad about it because he was like, he got kind of resentful that someone else had to solve his puzzle for him, right? Have alternate paths. Don't depend on the puzzle. If the puzzle becomes a roadblock, or you need the puzzle to be your source of tension, you are setting yourself up for disappointment. I mean, we all love them, but I think that we love them more than players love them, frankly.
Oh, me.
Alrighty.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I can kind of speak for some people at least. Can everyone hear me, of course? Say like you do have like a puzzle, or you have a dungeon where you want them to pursue it in a different way other than combat.
Yeah.
How do you protect that against the dreaded murder hobos?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's always the concept of overwhelming force. The idea that if you're going in and you're attacking everything, there's just going to be so many things that converge on you. There can also be situations where their PCs may not have the authority to be going in and attacking everything that's in there. Like maybe they're going in and they're going after some specific criminal that's in this area, but if they're just going to attack everyone, some of the people here are just innocent bystanders, and the guards sure aren't going to be happy about that. And but I guess when it comes down to it, if you have a group of players and what they want to do all day is they want to fight things and they don't want to do that other stuff, then there's nothing you can present other opportunities, but ultimately you can't make your players enjoy different parts of the game than they enjoy.
I just recently finished developing an adventure called Mutiny at Blooming Port. It's published by Go Games, and Jim Seals is the author. But he set up all these scenarios where the players encounter all these various NPCs, and Jim doesn't want you to fight through everything. He wants to create opportunities for social and that kind of problem solving. So one of his solutions was exactly what you were talking about, where there's this character, this NPC, and she's like collecting apples from this magical apple grove, right? And the players meet her. And if they try to draw swords on her, well, she's actually an ancient gold dragon in disguise. Right? So when they draw swords on her, she just turns into a gold dragon and burns them to death, right? Don't do that. But the other option was that they encounter these pirates, and these pirates, like when the players encounter the pirates are literally in the middle of a drinking game, and they're all at the benches with all this, and they sort of turn and like, who are you? And do you want a drink, right? And, you know, pirates, drinking game, like that sounds fun, right? So you can use overwhelming force, but if you present them with a non-combat situation with fun stuff, they might engage. Now they might still draw swords on the pirate gang. Okay, like we got to play that out because, like you say, you can't make them. This is the beauty and the curse of role-playing games, right? Is that it's not a novel. We don't control the characters. We all we can do is offer. And if they bite the hand, well, okay, that's the game you want to play, right? But there are a lot of ways. So give them some carrots, but also, you know, keep the stick handy, right?
To riff off of that gold dragon example a little
Yeah.
bit, if you're presenting someone who's very powerful that they really shouldn't antagonize, there's always the, you know, I'm not necessarily going to incinerate all of you
Right.
guys, but I'm going to give you a warning that this is not what you want to be doing right now.
Yeah, and that's good if you have a recurring group where you can actually tell them, like, okay, I could have killed all of you. Don't do that. In the next game, next adventure, when this happens again, they're like, hey, remember that gold dragon? Right.
Hi, I kind of have two questions. I hope that's okay. One of which is regarding like plot hooks. Like, what do you guys find to be like good ways when you're writing a dungeon design to get your adventurers interested in the dungeon you're designing? I mean,
yeah.
we've all done. We built a dungeon, and adventurers are like, oh yeah, hack and slash and poop, murder hobo through it. And the second one is the culmination of that. How do you make engaging and interesting boss fights? Like when you get to the end and it is that big strong dude, how do you make it so it's just not repeatedly just throwing your blade at him type deal?
Yes.
Like how do you make that like a dynamic, engaging experience?
Yeah. Good
Thank
question.
you.
Well, I'll answer the second question first. There are a lot of different ways to make the players engaged in a particular fight that you want to showcase. I mean, the first thing to do is to think about what you're designing sort of as a movie. And not only is this going to be the climax of the movie, but it's also going to be, there are going to be scenes from this in the trailer for the movie, right? It's just got to look cool. One of the ways that it's going to look cool is to have an environment that is engaging. And whether that environment is engaging because the villain knows how to use it against the heroes, or the heroes can figure out how to use it against the villain, either is good, both is best. To have a couple of different ways the environment can be used. A ton of minions is awesome. Not only minions that you've come into, you've gone through to get to the boss, but the boss is surrounded by minions that otherwise are particularly weak against the characters. What that is, it sets up something that they have to deal with, but something that they have to deal with that they can very competently overcome. So that allows, for example, somebody that's got the ability to, you know, charm a whole bunch of people. Right? My charm spell is going to be no good against the dragon, right? But I know my charm is going to take out several of the little kobolds that work for the dragon. That lets the players feel like they're making progress towards something, which is part of the goal of making it seem like a challenge, without making it seem like kind of a stone wall that you have to kind of throw yourself up against until something sticks. So environment and minion are my two big ones for that.
And what that goes sort of into a broader idea of choice. That there's more that the players can do in the encounter than all rush up to the boss and deal them damage until they're down, or throw a save or die spell and then he fails the spell and then it's like, what do you do now? So there's other things to fight, there's other things to interact with on the battle map. Do you want to go in the back way? Do you want to try to get the high ground on the boss? Is there other things that you can manipulate and interact with?
Once if you have a big boss fight, where are you? Who's the guy that asked the question? Oh, thank you. If you have a big boss fight, first thing is, no matter how many clever strategies you use, there will always be at least one player who will do everything possible to charge the boss and attack them, right? No matter what you do. If they kill the boss early, unless he's got a contingency raised dead, kill all the minions or have them all run away. Like, don't try to keep the fight going where they fight all the rest of it, because the climax is over. Your dungeon is over. You may have an hour left of gameplay, but the dungeon for the players is over. So let it be over, right? Don't try and nurse it along. Although, that being said, if they do kill him on the first round, maybe he does have a contingency raised dead. The second thing that I wanted to bring up is this idea of plot hooks. So your first question. Work with your players on this. Ask your players what motivates your character, right? I say this because I had a really bad experience. I was running this time travel campaign set in the Victorian period. And the players were contacted by various time travelers from the future who gave them the mission to prevent World War I and World War II and the Holocaust. Like, this is what's happening. Stop this from happening. In the second session, the players told me, we don't feel like we have any motivation for this adventure. You're stopping the Holocaust. What do I have to do? Talk to the players. Find out what motivates them, and then pander to them shamelessly, right? And it's going to be different. So once again, I'm going out of my company here, right? But remember the old Lost Mine of Phandelver, the basic adventure and the basic set. It's got all these different plot hooks for all the different backgrounds. Like, every background has its own plot hook, right? And you're the folk hero, or you're the merchant, or you're the soldier, or whatever. And one of those plot hooks is just money. Like, there's just people who are willing to pay. And another one is like, they're telling stories about you in this town, right? Or whatever. And so customize your plot hooks. Ask your players what motivates them, and then try to get one player to maybe help you out and invite the others along. Because the player characters may not have a reason to go, but if their friend asks them to go, they'll go.
That's a reason. That's sometimes the best reason,
Yeah.
right? There are plenty of players who are happy to have their character's motivation be, oh, I'm with this guy.
Yeah.
It doesn't hurt to have NPCs play to their egos too. The whole stereotypical, the guard captain comes up to you and she says, "Please, you are the only ones who can help. Everyone else is
We're the only ship in
otherwise
the
occupied."
quadrant.
Yes. We have heard of your great heroics and your exploits. Hope that I can count on you here. I have no one else to turn to, etc.
Yeah, that works great in a longer campaign, because you can play off things that have happened in the campaign before and make them feel like, oh yeah, maybe we are the people that defeated the ogre bandit of such and such, and maybe we are up for this.
We have a question from Twitch from the Real POTUS98. Besides cave-ins, what would be some methods to dissuade parties from running back to town to recharge and re-get their resources back?
Timers. Either that the main villain is going to be doing they've got a ritual that's going to take a certain amount of time, especially if you've got town that's far away. That's going to be a problem. If you know that they've taken hostages, that they're going to start killing hostages after a certain amount of time. Oh, we certainly can't wait. We have to keep going. That's also a way. In addition to keeping players from doing something longer, like going back to town, that also helps build the tension of, well, we need to do just one more. Okay, we're gonna have to take 10 minutes to rest and recover our focus powers or treat wounds in second edition parlance, but or get our stamina back. But if they want to push even faster to delay that, then you're building a real sense of urgency there.
How do you deal with dungeon bleed? Like, for instance, your players use Thunder Wave in one room and the next room over has a bunch of enemies, and this is a fortress, there's going to be an alarm, and now just everything is coming up them all at once. And I had this problem with one game where that happened, and then they immediately went towards the boss and ignored the entire rest of the dungeon because they kill everything else in the dungeon because it all went to them. So what are your thoughts on
Well, I mean, there are different priorities. For example, if you have a fortress, there's always the possibility, if you're guarding a fortress, that this big obvious group that's got lightning in the front isn't the only group that's in there, right? They have their other priorities that they need to protect. So that would involve keeping their boss safe. That would involve protecting the treasures that they have. If they have hostages, making sure that no one's trying to spring those out. So you can have them cluster more around some of those focal points. So then sure, you have that front vanguard that goes out to attack the PCs, but they also have their other priorities as well.
Sometimes you can actually embrace this. Some of the best sessions I've had running dungeons lately, the players have managed to activate practically every encounter on the map simultaneously. and the trick is to have each door open with another swarm of goblins attack them, like 1 round or 2 rounds separate from each other, right? Because although, yes, you've alerted the entire tower, every tower is not 1 door away, right? And so right as the players think we've won, or right as they feel like they're starting to get a handle on the mobs, another door opens and 5 more goblins charge in, and the players are like, no, yeah. And every time you get to the top of the encounter of the initiative chart, they wait for you to say, and another door opens and more goblins rush in. and so embrace it. See if you can get it to work, because it can be really memorable. But in addition, to get back to how to stop this from happening, you might have ways in which your dungeon is compartmentalized. Now, the archetypal way to do this is with levels. So don't put everything on one level, so that if they do alert everything, who's the person that asked the question? Sorry. Oh yeah. If they do put if you put everything on one level, then one thunder wave can alert everybody. But if you split it up so that it's on different floors, they can only alert the people that are on that floor, right? And there's a lot of ways to do this. That's just sort of the classic way of doing it.
Whatever solution you're going to have, it's sometimes effective to communicate it to your players. If whoever's saying you've got to go assault the evil keep filled with hobgoblins is able to tell them, somebody else tried with an attempt to pull everybody to, pull all the forces together, but it didn't work because these hobgoblins are so well trained that they stay at their posts, assuming that the initial attack is a distraction. Then the players get thinking, oh, we can use that to our advantage, right? And then they're not going to, not only are the dungeon denizens not going to do what you don't want them to do, but the players know that and can build their tactics off of it in a way that results in them having discrete manageable fights.
And when the players make a decision and they make a strategy that actually works in the game, they feel like champions. Like they really do. They feel like they're winning the dungeon, and that's good.
Yeah. And Jason, before you talked about factions, and this is another place where factions can very much come into
true,
play.
yes.
If you have 2 factions that don't necessarily get along, members of the other faction might want to wait and see if the first faction can be the one to take the casualties and handle the danger before they get their hands dirty.
And this doesn't all have to be like, orcs versus kobolds either. It can totally be within one kind of hegemonic group. Like it might be the city guard versus the musketeers. Like, well, these people have been rivals for decades, and the city guard is out front, and we're going to let them fight the adventurers for a while, and then maybe we'll come in, but we don't have to rush in right away.
The city guard have always said they had it handled. They don't need us. Well, then I'm sure that that when they can either handle it themselves, or when we come in to save them, they can apologize for not respecting us.
And while we wait, this tea is really great too. Like they'll just sit back and take a rest. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Well, this was a lot of fun. Thank you all very much.
Thanks so much.